Hi, welcome to this episode of Halva for the Heart. My name is Misha. I am a death doula and grief tender. And today we're going to be answering a question that I've been getting quite a lot lately. What is a death doula? Why would I need a death doula? What do you do? What do you provide? When would I call you? It's something that people just don't know, and that's okay. We're going to go over it all today. So why would you hire a death doula? What do we do? What are we for? The first thing I want to say is that a death doula is for everybody. It seems pretty obvious, but we're all gonna die. We are all dying, right? Every single day, every moment of our lives. And we're not actively dying. People often think that a death doula is only called in when the person is actively dying, when they're in their final moments. And that's simply not the case. A death doula is for anyone, all of us who are dying in every moment of every day. And a death doula is also for those of us who are grieving, which is all of us. Most of us live with, I would say all of us, live with unprocessed, unacknowledged griefs, perhaps passed down from previous generations. Simply the grief of living under systems of oppression. That is a grief that often goes unnamed. We are all grieving things. And when they go unprocessed, they turn into anger. I have other episodes about this. So yeah, that's a death doula can help with the dying process and the grieving process. And that's literally everyone. There are different roles in both of those kinds of work, whether with the end of life or dying process or with the grieving. There's different roles that a death doula can take. So I'm just going to go over those real quick, and then we'll dive into the specifics of how a death doula can help you at different moments of your life. So when working with the end of life with dying people, a death doula may help you write your advance directive and get your estate in order. They may be an educator to teach you about your options at the end of life. They may teach you about the different after death options, funeral options. Do you want a home funeral? Do you want a green burial? Those sorts of things. And they can also help in the day-to-day, helping to manage like the household, to give respite to the caregivers, to sit vigil when that time comes, when the person is actively dying. And they can also simply be a companion with the person who's dying, because maybe they may not have people around them who will sit with them in their dying process. And I think one aspect that goes unmentioned too often is the role of the advocate, to really advocate for the dying person's wishes. And that means sometimes standing up against the family and also standing up against the medical system that we live under. Overall, a death doula is someone who's fulfilling an ancient role, right? People have died at home for millennia. People have died at home for millennia. They've been cared for by their family, by their loved ones, by their communities. This whole hospice medical industrial complex is a very new thing in human history. And so the death doula is bringing that care that's been removed by the medical industrial complex and bringing it back to the deathbed. I like to say that a death doula is an ancient role, but with a modern title, right? People who worked in this role didn't often have titles. They were just known as the person in the community you would call when someone was dying. They were known as people, often women or AFAB people, who could hold the sacredness of transitions, both birth and death. That they knew that this was a moment that needed tenderness and care and just a time of spirit. So if you or someone you love, maybe they've gotten a terminal diagnosis or a life-limiting diagnosis of some sort, or maybe they just want to prepare for that moment when it comes. someone who's not actively dying, who's not at the end of their life yet, but want to address that time because they know it's coming. In that situation, people may reach out to a death doula to really sit with their mortality, be more intentional, and to get clarity around what it means to be a mortal being. What does it mean that my life will end? A death doula can guide people through meditations, conversations around fears about dying. Maybe they're scared of the pain. Maybe they're scared of the unknown. Maybe they're scared, like the fear that I have around dying is people forgetting me, becoming forgotten. So questions around legacy, around meaning making of life. Those are the sorts of topics a death doula can guide you through. And then in that mortality at work, to really imagine your ideal end of life situation. We're all going to die. And so ideally, what do you want your death to look like, feel like, smell like, taste like, sound like? Really get into that sensory experience of what it's going to feel like to die. Who do you want around you? Do you want to hear them crying? Do you want to hear them laughing? Do you want to hear them singing? Do you want to be in silence? Those are really specific details. So when the moment comes, when I say like a death doula is your advocate, when the moment comes, the death doula can make your dying space as close to your ideal scenario as possible. And having a clear plan can not only ease the weight placed on your caregivers and loved ones around, like, I don't know what they would want, it also can potentially minimize conflicts between family members that may have differing opinions about what should be done. The death doula can step in and be like, we all agreed that we would do our best to fulfill the dying person's wishes, right? Yes? Let's go back to the document. Let's go back to what they wanted. And we'll follow that as well as and as closely as we can. A death doula can also guide you through filling out paperwork like advance directives, like do not resuscitate orders, those sorts of things that are legally binding and can put you in the direction of if you want to speak to a lawyer or a estate planner, those sorts of things. They know people, they can help you find someone who can fit your needs. And then, of course, exploring after death wishes. A lot of people think that burial or cremation are the only two options, and that's not the case. They also often think that as soon as someone dies, you need to call the funeral home and the body needs to be whisked away. That's also not the case. In most places, I'm going to speak about North America. In most places in North America, United States and Canada, that's not the case. And people just simply don't know. They don't know that they can spend more time with the person who has died before their body is taken. They can sit with them, they can invite people over, they can have a wake, and seeing, I don't know if there's been research on this, but I'm I'm going to say that there's data that being with the body of the person who has died helps tremendously in your grieving process. Our brains, as intelligent as we are, if we do not see the person who has died, it's hard for us to really comprehend that they are gone. And so sitting with the body, and especially with other people who love them, that is so healing and something I would recommend to everyone if they're able to. So home funerals are similar to a wake. Having them at the house is something that people don't know that they have a right to do in most places. You can keep the body at home. You can keep the loved one at home and you can care for them. You can care for them. It is a beautiful gift to be able to care for them after they've died. It's tender, it's loving, it's sacred work. And again, helps tremendously with the grieving process. And then different options for body disposition, you know? Like I said, people often think that burial and cremation are the only options. People often think that if they're getting buried, they have to be embalmed. That's not the case. Green burials are becoming more and more popular. I also want to note that green burials are not a new thing. Similarly, how like death doulas are not a new thing. People have been having quote unquote green burials for millennia. How do you think most humans have been buried? They dug a hole and they put them in the ground. That's a green burial. It's returning to these ancestral practices. That is the way that we have lived and died and grieved for most of human history. And there's a reason for that. It's because it's what's most healing and most supportive in those vulnerable times. So, depending on where you are, you can do a green burial. You can potentially, if you own property, have a burial on your property. You can, in some places, do a burial at sea. You can do water cremation in many places. There's so many options, so many options. And a death doula will really help you think about what you want. I feel like oftentimes people say, "I'll just cremate me because I don't want to be a burden. I don't want, you know." And I think the decision, I'm not saying it's a wrong decision. I just wonder if people are really sitting with it and really weighing the different choices and thinking about why would they want to be cremated? Is it really just because it seems like they don't want to think about it? Maybe they just want to make a decision and that seems cheaper, so they'll pick that. Yeah, but it's you. It's your body. What do you want to happen to it after you die? I think it's a very personal decision, but it requires the person to get comfortable in the fact that they're going to die, and that can be really scary. So a death doula is there to sit with you through all of that. And of course, to advocate for you when the time comes, if you're not able to advocate for yourself or need extra support. When someone is getting closer to the moment of death, that's kind of the time when people normally think, oh, I should get a death doula. But oftentimes it's too late. You know, a lot of times the family and the people don't want to admit that they're dying. They think we have more time, we have more time, we have more time. We'll call when it's really, really time. And then the time comes and they never called someone for help. Or they think they have to wait until their doctor refers them to hospice before they can call a death doula when people don't often spend that much time on hospice, you know, and then a death doula is never called. Or people think that hospice will be enough. And at least in North America, I know in other countries, especially the UK, hospice does a lot more. But in the US, and I believe Canada, hospice does not do nearly as much as people think they do. They're not legally required to. And most hospice companies are for-profit companies. And as any for-profit company will do, they will get away with as little as they have to do in order to make a profit. So that means they are following the bare minimum legal requirements that the federal government puts in place for hospice companies. And that means like 2, 3 visits a week. Maybe like 2 visits from a nurse, a visit or 2 from a CNA, a nursing assistant. You might, maybe, get a visit from a social worker. Maybe you'll get a visit from a chaplain. You won't see a doctor. Well, not likely. Oftentimes, hospices are legally required to have a doctor on staff. That doesn't mean the doctor is going to come see you. The doctor will look over your charts and your case and give orders to the nurses. But you're unlikely to see a hospice doctor. And so nurses are coming a couple times a week. Nurses' assistants are coming a couple times a week for like 45 minutes to an hour at a time. Who is doing the rest of the care? 23 hours out of the day when hospice isn't there, who's doing the care? It's usually the family. And it's not like hospice puts you through training when you're referred to hospice and they tell you exactly what to do and what to expect and how to handle certain situations. Not really. They'll answer your questions if you know what questions to ask, but people often don't. It's interesting to me that, like, when people get diagnosed, hypothetically, let's say someone gets diagnosed with cancer, there are whole organizations in place to help people navigate cancer diagnoses, to help and say, you should ask your doctor these questions, or be on the lookout for a doctor who says this, like make sure you get a second opinion. There's all these pieces of advice that people give when they're given a terminal diagnosis. But when it comes to navigating the end of life itself, regardless of the reason for the end of life, people don't know these things. They don't know these things, and hospice does not educate as well as they should because they're not legally required to. And remember, they do the bare minimum that they're legally required to. And that doesn't involve educating. So they don't. This isn't to bash hospice workers. Hospice workers work so hard. Their caseloads are way too heavy. They're seeing multiple patients during a day and they're doing the best they can. They are absolutely doing the best they can. It's the system that doesn't allow them to give them the care and support that people deserve at the end of life. And that's because we live under capitalism. Honestly, that's why. It's these systems that want to profit off of dying people. So why would you call a death doula? You call a death doula to fill in the gaps. Hospice is there to provide the bare minimum and mostly medical support. They are required to have at least one chaplain and one social worker on staff. Whether or not you actually see those people, hit or miss, right? And so they're there to answer mostly medical questions and to make sure you're not in physical pain. That's their primary goal, is to make sure you're not in physical pain. But that means there are a lot of things that aren't being addressed. And so a death doula will be there to help you go through the emotional and spiritual stages of dying, right? To address your concerns, your regrets, any unfinished business you may have, to help you think about the existential questions about what it means to die and what you think it's like on the other side, and to hold that spiritual, sacred space for the family. It's something that the certainly hospitals and most hospices don't prioritize. But dying is a sacred threshold transition, and it needs to be treated that way. But it's not profitable, so they don't. So a death doula would help maintain the sacredness of the moment, to make sure your wishes are getting fulfilled. You know, like we said, if you had like certain smells or sounds you wanted to hear, to help make that happen. Oftentimes people think that they can't do things in a hospital if the person's in a hospital just because it's a hospital. But that's not always the case. A death doula is there to do that legwork for you, to ask those questions and to fulfill your wishes the best they can. They're also there to educate, so the family knows they are educated and knowledgeable about what to expect as a body transitions into death. And not just the body, but the mind. There are signs that aren't quote unquote medical signs of dying that are really unexplainable by modern science, but they're still signs of dying. They're a sign that someone is nearing death. Things like oftentimes dying people will reach up to the ceiling or upwards or look upwards and a little bit to the right. And no one really has an explanation for that. And I don't know if many hospice nurses will tell you to be like, that's normal. That's something to expect. Don't be concerned. That just means they're nearing death. They're getting closer. That's okay. So a death doula really is there to make your death as personal as you would like to your wishes, and to also make it less clinical, make it more sacred, more familial, more tender. And then sometimes people hire a death doula after the death has already occurred. You know, they weren't expecting the person to die this soon, and they did. So a death doula can come in immediately after a death and kind of guide next steps. This can also be if the death is unexpected, right? So they can guide next steps depending on their legal requirements around, like, if a body is found dead, the police need to be called because they have to rule out homicide. But again, those are things that a death doula will know. If someone was terminally ill and that was known, perhaps they're on hospice, but a death doula was not called until after the death, that's totally fine. A death doula can help explain your rights. Like I said, like people don't know they can keep the body at home. In some places, you don't even technically need to work with a funeral director, although it's recommended, but you don't need to in some places. And they may not like me saying that because just as the medical industrial complex has a stronghold on the dying process, the funeral industrial complex is just as strong and often just as for profit and guided by capitalism. So a death doula can help connect you with funeral homes that are more sympathetic, more gentle, perhaps more in line with your values. It can help demystify any confusion around what you're allowed to do in the area you are. And, maybe your person wanted to have something done with their body that just like isn't possible where you are. And so a death doula can help guide the family through different options that are available. And then also after the death has occurred, of course, there's also grief care that a death doula can offer. And that can look like a variety of different ways. It can be one-on-one, simply talking with someone as a sort of counseling. It can also be perhaps more non-traditional ways of, well, non-traditional is a funny word because they are in fact ancient and traditional, but kind of not common in today's world as ways of processing grief, perhaps through song and dance, which used to be common, perhaps through making, crafting, which was also common, and perhaps through cooking. Food is so, so healing. And so there are ways that our ancestors tended to their grief that they knew was helpful and supportive that we've kind of lost touch with. And a death doula can help guide you back to that. There's also, this can be done before or after a person dies, but they're called legacy projects. But it's really just another thing you can do, right? When we're talking about grief care as creating something, as a creative practice, creating a legacy project is similar. I mentioned in a previous podcast episode about how I made my mom a book of stories about her. I requested stories from all of her friends and family, and I called it her Happy Memories book. And that's a legacy project. It's a way to remember her. I made that before she died and was actually able to read it to her, but that's something you could do after the fact as well. There are different sorts of legacy projects. People often make like memorial quilts, or they make something out of the person's clothing, or they preserve their recipes. Any way to to preserve a part of them and to remember them by is a legacy project. Honestly, even like creating an altar for them. The act of creating is really important in the grieving process. So a death doula can guide people through that as well. So those are just some ways that a death doula can help people throughout their lifespan, right? Early on before terminal diagnosis or that the knowledge that death is near, and then as death gets closer, and then after the death, assisting the family and survivors, and also making sure the person's wishes were upheld. And that took me about 20 minutes to explain. And that's why it's so hard to answer the question when people are like, Death doula, what do you do? What does that mean? It's a complex role. It involves a lot of parts. And yet it's also, like I said, very ancient. This is a role that people, mostly women or AFAB people, have fulfilled all over the world in a variety of cultures for centuries and centuries. There's always someone who knows how to care for the dying and the dead and the grieving. And sometimes they weren't all the same person. I've been doing some reading into Celtic traditions, and there's keeners, the women who would keen at the Irish wakes and help the family grieve. They were sometimes, but not always, the same person as the woman who would come and care for the dying body. So sometimes the roles were separate, and not all death doulas will fulfill all these roles. We each certainly have our own specialty and what we are called to, but that doesn't mean that a death doula doesn't do these things. The way that I view death doulas is that we are a role that we've been around since pre-industrialization, pre-capitalism, and we will remain as we're watching these empires begin to collapse in on themselves. The death doula role will remain. People are always going to die, and they'll always need support in the dying and grieving process. Every community, every society needs death doulas, needs someone to care for the dying, needs someone to know how to tend to the dying. And that's what we do. And to do that, especially with sacredness and the intention of knowledge that this is a moment of ritual, a moment that needs spiritual presence. I truly believe the deaths of the future, whatever comes next after capitalism, will be treated as more sacred, will be acknowledged as a spiritual moment. And the dying will be cared for in a way that honors that sacred moment. So I hope this answered some of your questions, and I hope it left you with some questions. What is it that you want at your end of life? Who do you trust to advocate for you? Who do you feel comfortable even sharing your wishes with? And do you think dying is a sacred experience? Some people don't. What would you want or not want to preserve that sacred moment? I'm curious how you answer those questions and whether you have some ideas or further questions for me. You can reach me through my email, misha@hafizdeathcare.com. You can also send me a message on Instagram. I'm at hafiz.death.care. And you can send me a voice note. The link to that is in the show notes. I hope this gave you a better understanding as to what a death doula does and when and why you'd call one. If you would like to work with me, I'm available. You can head to my website and get in touch. I offer 30-minute complimentary calls so we can see how best I can support you at whatever moment in life you're in. So that's it for today. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.